Al Jazeera has spoken to an injured Palestinian man who was used as a human shield by Israeli forces in Jenin in the occupied West Bank. Mujahid Abadi was strapped to the front of an Israeli military vehicle on Saturday, which drove past several ambulances. For the first time, Abadi explains what happened to him.
I received a phone call yesterday morning that Israeli special forces are in the neighborhood. I was at my uncle's home. My cousins and I stepped out to check and found them a few meters away. As we started to go back home, the Israeli soldiers opened fire on us. My cousins were injured, and I also received a bullet in my arm. I fell behind an Israeli armored vehicle parked outside my uncle's house. The Israeli soldiers kept firing, and by the time I fell to the ground, I received another bullet in my leg. Some of our friends and neighbors were also injured. The Israeli soldiers rounded them all up, but they could not reach me behind the armored vehicle. They shouted at me to step forward. I replied I was injured and could not move. The Israeli soldier replied then, "You should die there." I remained on the ground bleeding for more than 2 hours. None of the soldiers approached me, only one drone hovering above me. I kept bleeding. After that, another Israeli armored vehicle approached the one I was lying behind. They tried to run me over. There's a lot of footage proving all this. I crawled with difficulty and came clear within their range. As they approached, one of the soldiers trampled my head under his boot, kept punching me in the face, kicking my bleeding leg. He twisted my injured arm. My leg and arm bones were broken, totally crushed. The Israeli soldiers kept laughing and mocking while beating me to death. 2 Israeli soldiers grabbed my hands and 2 others my feet, then started swinging me left to right. I fell to the ground twice, and on the 3rd attempt, they shoved me over the hood. It was extremely hot that my back was burnt. They drove me back and forth for 20 minutes. I had hoped to be dead before the Israeli soldiers arrived. I had expected them to attend to my wounds, not to beat and batter me, while I already had 2 critical injuries. The Israeli soldiers kept me on the armored vehicle's hood for 20 minutes, driving back and forth. And finally, they drove me on the vehicle to the main road where the Israeli soldiers were stationed.
Let's bring in Al Jazeera's Nida Ibrahim, who's in Ramallah force in the occupied West Bank. Nida, more details emerging about this incident, which the Israeli military says it's investigating.
Yes, indeed. This time we see the Israeli army releasing a statement saying that this is not the usual practice and that they're going to be investigating this incident. But looking at the cases, the multiple cases we've been reporting on here from the occupied West Bank, it shows that this is not an isolated incident. This is something that Palestinians go through day in and day out. The fact that we have a video is one of the reasons why this story went viral, and the Israeli army was forced to respond really to contain some of the damage, the PR damage that might have been caused to the image of the Israeli army. But if you speak to Palestinians who undergo these usual Israeli raids in the occupied West Bank, they would tell you it's not new. And we've been reporting on the Israeli use of Palestinians as human shields for a long time now. Human rights organizations have been accusing Israel of using Palestinians as human shields in the continued Israeli raids. And we've also been reporting since the war started on the extensive use of beating Palestinians up and torturing them and humiliating them while there are arrest operations. So while we see this video and we're talking about it, we've been speaking to Mujahid about the pain, about the burns in his back from being on the hot engine of the military vehicle on a hot day here in the occupied West Bank. Let's not forget that there are dozens, if not more, Palestinians who are suffering from the continued humiliation, mistreatment by the Israeli forces, that Palestinians would tell you that so long as there is no accountability, these actions will continue to happen.
Nida, thank you very much. That's Al Jazeera's Nida Ibrahim reporting there live from Ramallah. Well, let's discuss this further now with Sari Bashi, who's the program director at Human Rights Watch. She's also joining us from the occupied West Bank. Sari, good to have you with us on Al Jazeera. Mujahid Abadi's description of his ordeal is quite shocking. And as Nida said, not an isolated incident. What struck you most about this particular incident?
So I can provide some context for what's taking place in the West Bank and express some concerns about a lack of accountability. We're experiencing an unprecedented escalation of violence. Last year, Israeli forces killed nearly 500 Palestinians in the West Bank, including more than 100 children. That's double the figure from last year. And Palestinians in the West Bank killed 25 Israeli civilians, as well as 5 Israeli soldiers, which is also more than in any recent year recorded by the United Nations. Part of what's happening is that there are much more frequent search and arrest operations and other kinds of incursions into Palestinian cities and towns, like we saw yesterday. So on average, the Israeli military is conducting 640 search and arrest and other operations in the West Bank every month, which is about double what it's been during the parallel period. So there's much more interactions, violent interactions, right, between Israeli soldiers and Palestinians.
Sari, on the specific issue of Palestinians being used as human shields, how common and frequent is that? Is that systemic, you would say?
So I don't have information about this specific case. I don't know if it's a case of a human shield. What I can say is that Human Rights Watch, as well as other human rights organizations, have documented various unlawful uses of force against Palestinians, including unlawful killings, using lethal force unlawfully, denying medical care, and using other kinds of beatings, including of children. I'm particularly concerned about a permissive environment that gives soldiers on the ground a sense of impunity. So I understand that the Israeli authorities have said that they're going to investigate. The concern is that the Israeli human rights group B'Tselem, as well as other human rights organizations, have characterized the Israeli investigative system as a whitewash. Because you have senior officials, including senior politicians, calling for no restrictions on the use of force against Palestinians in the West Bank. So under those circumstances, it's quite difficult to see how we could have accountability.
I was going to ask you about that, in fact, because the Israeli army is saying now that this incident and the abuse that this man sustained at the hand of Israeli soldiers breaches its values. But you wonder what values they're talking about and what is being done by the Israeli army to try and stop these types of abuses from happening, if anything at all.
So Human Rights Watch is calling for for international accountability. The prosecutor for the International Criminal Court is seeking arrest warrants for senior Israeli officials, including the prime minister and defense minister, as well as for senior Hamas leaders. And we believe that's appropriate because the Israeli internal system has proven itself unwilling and or unable to investigate these kinds of crimes. Just to give you an example, just this month, Brigadier General Yisrael Shomer, who in 2015 used unlawful lethal force against a Palestinian child. This was a very well-documented case where a 17-year-old boy threw a rock that damaged his military vehicle and then ran away, and he pursued him and shot him to death, in violation even of Israeli rules of engagement. There was an inquiry, no criminal charges were filed, and this month he received an honorary doctorate at the Reichman University in Israel. So under circumstances in which senior leaders are not only disobeying international human rights law, but also Israel's own rules of engagement with lethal consequences and then being awarded honorary doctorates, it's hard to see how soldiers on the ground would be encouraged to follow even Israeli rules, let alone international human rights law.
And it's hard to see, Sari, how the situation on the ground can improve at all when we're now seeing the Netanyahu government increasingly transferring control from the military to civilian aspects of its far-right government in the occupied West Bank. How concerning is that to you, and how much worse will it make it for Palestinians in the occupied West Bank?
I mean, look, the decentralization of violence through state-sponsored settler violence is very worrying. It has led to deaths as well as forced displacement of thousands of Palestinians who are fleeing their land because of settler violence and settler intimidation. We think that what would make a difference, or if these arrest warrants were issued, and if the criminal proceedings at the International Criminal Court are allowed to take their course. We also are calling on all states to stop, to suspend arms transfers to the Israeli military, as well as Hamas and Islamic Jihad, because these weapons are being used against civilians unlawfully. That would make a difference.
Sari, thank you so much for talking to us. Sari Bashi is the Programme Director at Human Rights Watch, joining us there from the occupied West Bank. Thank you very much for your time. Make sure to subscribe to our channel to get the latest news from Al Jazeera.